The John Deere dealership in Van Wert, Ohio, occupied a corner lot on the state route heading south out of town, and in the early spring of 1974, it had the specific character of an agricultural equipment dealership at the peak of the commodity boom. New machines gleaming in the lot under the March light, the service bays busy, the sales floor carrying the particular energy of an era when farmers were being told by every institution around them that now was the time to expand, to modernize, to replace, to scale. The salesmen at the Van Wert dealership in 1974 were selling the future of American agriculture, or they believed they were, and the future looked like new iron in straight rows and financing packages that the current land values easily supported. The man who drove into the dealership lot on a Tuesday morning in the second week of March 1974 did not look like the future of American agriculture. He was 61 years old, which was not old for a Van Wert County farmer, but which communicated, combined with the truck he drove and the equipment he was towing, a relationship to the agricultural present that was different from the dealership's vision of the agricultural future. The truck was a 1963 Ford F100 that had been maintained correctly across 11 years, and that showed maintenance rather than newness, the specific appearance of a working vehicle in working condition that has not been recently repainted. Behind the truck, on a flatbed trailer, was a John Deere grain drill that had been manufactured in 1951, 23 years old, and that had the surface rust and weathered condition of implement iron that has spent its working life in Ohio weather. The old man's name was Walter Frick, and he farmed 220 acres of Van Wert County ground that his family had been working since the 1890s, and he had driven to the dealership for parts. The 1951 grain drill had a seed metering unit on its third row position that had developed a wear pattern across the previous planting season that Walter had diagnosed over the winter as a specific disc-bearing failure. Not the disc itself, not the seed tube, but the bearing assembly that the disc rode on, which had developed an oval wear pattern that was producing inconsistent seed spacing on that row position when the drill was working at the planting depth the rotation required. He had identified the part number from the drill's service manual, which he had obtained from the previous owner at the drill's purchase in 1958, and which he had maintained in the same filing cabinet as the farm account since. He had called the dealership's parts department in February to confirm the bearing assembly was available, and had been told yes, it was available, he could come in and pick it up. He had come in on the Tuesday morning in March with the drill on the trailer because he intended to confirm the part number match at the dealer before he purchased, a practice he had maintained with every implement part he had ever bought, the specific caution of a man who understands that a wrong part purchased confidently is more expensive than the extra time required to confirm the part number against the machine before buying. He had parked the truck and trailer in the dealer lot and had gone into the parts counter and had given the parts man the part number from the service manual. The parts man had gone to the back and returned with the bearing assembly and had set it on the counter. Walter had taken it to the trailer and had compared it against the worn bearing on the drill's third row position and had confirmed the match and had returned to the parts counter to complete the purchase. The salesman who had been watching from the showroom floor had come out to the parts counter during this process. He was in his mid-30s, one of the dealership's better performers in the current selling environment, a man who understood the commodity boom's implications for equipment sales, and who was skilled at identifying the specific moment when a farmer's need for parts on an old machine could be converted into a conversation about replacement. An old man on a Tuesday morning with a 23-year-old drill on his trailer was not an unusual presentation of this opportunity. The salesman had seen versions of this situation before and had converted a number of them. He had said to Walter, with the specific friendliness of a man opening a prepared door, "That is a pretty tired-looking drill out there." We have got some excellent planting equipment this season that would give you a lot more precision than what you are working with." Walter had looked at him. He had said, "The drill is working correctly. It needs a bearing on the third row position. I am here for the bearing." The salesman had said, "A 23-year-old machine. How can you get the seed placement you need from iron that old?" Walter had said, "I calibrate it. It places correctly when it is calibrated. The third row bearing needs replacement, and then it will place correctly again." The salesman had looked at the drill on the trailer through the parts counter window. He had said, "With all respect, that machine is too old to compete with what the new equipment can do for your yields. The seed-to-soil contact on the current JD drills is significantly better than anything built in 1951. Walter had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "What are my current yields?" The salesman had paused. He had said, "I don't know your current yields." Walter had said, "Then you cannot tell me whether my current equipment is competitive with anything. The bearing, please." He had paid for the bearing and had returned to the trailer and had confirmed the installation orientation against the service manual and had loaded the bearing in the truck cab for the drive back to the farm. As he pulled out of the dealer lot, he had been aware, without turning to confirm it, that the salesman was watching from the parts counter window with the specific expression of a man who has been given an answer he was not prepared to handle. The salesman had said something to the parts man after Walter's truck left the lot. The parts man had reported it later to a nephew who worked in the Van Wert County Agricultural Network as approximately, "The old man with the rusty drill thought his planting was fine." The transmission had been through several community channels by the time it reached anyone who knew Walter Frick well enough to have an opinion about it. By the time it reached the people who knew Walter Frick well enough to have an opinion about it, it had acquired the slight edge of laughter that community transmissions acquire when they are about an old man's stubbornness in the face of a salesman's wisdom. The laughter was premature. It was based on the visible evidence: the 1963 Ford, the 1951 drill, the rusted surface of implement iron that had spent 23 Ohio winters outdoors. Without access to the invisible evidence, which was the calibration record that Walter maintained for every piece of equipment on the farm, and which, for the grain drill, showed a planting accuracy that was not a matter of faith or stubbornness, but of documented measurement, repeated across 16 planting seasons since Walter had bought the drill at a Paulding County estate sale in 1958 and had calibrated it from the service manual before its first Frick Farm season. The calibration record was a separate section of the service log that Walter had started for the drill in the spring of 1958. Not just the maintenance, the hydraulic fold, the depth control springs, the seed disc condition, the fertilizer tube integrity, but the specific calibration measurements that the service manual described, the seed metering rate at the dial settings for each crop, confirmed by the catch and weigh method at the start of each planting season on a test strip before the field work began. 12 feet of calibrated run on a known weight of seed in each metering cup, compared against the target seeding rate for the variety being planted, adjustment made until the measured rate was within 2% of the target. 2% of target, confirmed before every planting season since 1958. The salesman had said the seed-to-soil contact on the current JD drills was significantly better than anything built in 1951. This was possibly true on a new drill with factory-fresh disc openers and the specific down-pressure settings of an uncompromised unit. It was not true of the 1951 drill, in the condition Walter maintained it. The disc openers replaced on the schedule that the service log's annual disc thickness measurement determined was appropriate, the down-pressure springs confirmed against the specification each season, the coulter condition assessed, and the worn units replaced before they had degraded past the threshold that consistent furrow formation required. The disc opener replacement schedule was one of the service log's more precise records. Walter had obtained the disc opener wear specification from the service manual and had been measuring disc thickness at the start of each planting season since 1958, recording the measurements in the log and comparing them against the replacement threshold. The discs on the outside rows, which wore faster because they worked more ground per season on the headland turns, were replaced on a different schedule than the center rows, because the wear data showed different wear rates at different positions, and the replacement decision was made from the data rather than from a uniform time-based schedule. This was the specific kind of precision management that the Van Wert dealership salesman had not imagined was being applied to the rusty implement on the flatbed trailer. Walter had installed the new bearing on the third row position in the last week of March, following the installation procedure in the service manual with the specific care of a man who has been doing this kind of work since he was 19 years old, and who understands that the installation procedure exists because the bearing's orientation and preload matter to its service life, and that a correctly installed bearing lasts what the manufacturer specified, while an incorrectly installed bearing lasts less. He had done the post-installation calibration run on the affected row before considering the service complete. The catch and weigh on the third row alone, confirming that the replacement bearing had restored the metering accuracy the worn unit had been degrading. The 1974 spring planting had gone in during the second week of May, in the weather window that the Van Wert County spring produced, when the soil temperature and the soil moisture aligned at the levels that the rotation soybeans and corn required. Walter had done the full drill calibration on the test strip at the edge of the home field. All 12 rows confirmed at the target rate for the soybean variety he was planting first, before the first full field pass. The calibration had taken an hour and 15 minutes. The field work had proceeded on the confirmed calibration. The 1974 soybean yield on the 220 Frick acres had been the highest in the farm's documented history. Not marginally higher, meaningfully higher, the kind of yield that attracted attention at the elevator when the wagon loads came in and the ticket totals were visible to the other farmers delivering in the same days. The county average soybean yield for 1974 in Van Wert County had been approximately 28 bushels per acre. Walter's documented yield for that season was 41 bushels per acre, a differential that the farming community found impossible to attribute to single-cause explanations, and that attracted the specific kind of agricultural conversation that anomalous yield results generate. The conversation had gone through multiple channels in the fall of 1974 and into the winter of 1975, as yield results became available for comparison, and the Frick Farms numbers moved through the elevator network and the Farm Bureau and the Van Wert County Extension Office, and the specific informal network of farmers who track each other's outcomes with the attentive professionalism of people competing on the same resource base. Several factors had contributed to the 1974 yield. The season's weather had been favorable: adequate June rainfall, good August temperatures, a dry harvest window. Walter's soil management had been consistent for many years, a rotation and fertility program that had been building organic matter in the Van Wert County ground since the 1950s, and that the farm accounts fertilizer records showed had been applied at the correct rates without the cost-cutting that shorter-term financial pressure sometimes produced in less disciplined operations. And the seeding rate, the specific confirmed 2% accurate seeding rate from the calibrated drill, had placed the seed population that the 1974 season's favorable conditions could express at maximum efficiency. The seeding rate mattered because the relationship between plant population and yield potential was non-linear in soybeans. Too low a population left yield on the table because the available light and soil resources were underutilized. Too high a population created intraspecific competition that reduced individual plant productivity. The optimum population for the 1974 variety under Van Wert County conditions had been confirmed by the Extension Service's variety trial data that Walter had been reading since the extension began publishing it, and the optimum population was what the calibrated drill placed within 2% in the May planting window. The uncalibrated drill, or the drill calibrated nominally at the dial setting without the catch-and-weigh confirmation, placed the seed population that the dial said it would place, which was not necessarily the population the dial was designed to place when the metering units had accumulated wear, or the spring tension had shifted, or the seed size of the specific variety differed from the variety the drill had been set up for. The difference between the nominal rate and the confirmed rate was often within acceptable margins. Sometimes it was not. In 1974, on the Frick farm, the confirmed rate was producing the specific population that the favorable weather could express at the 41 bushel level. The Van Wert dealership's salesman had heard the Frick yield number at the elevator in October of 1974. He had confirmed it with the elevator manager, who had no reason to misstate a customer's yield data and who had confirmed the number. The salesman had stood with the confirmation for a moment and had then said to the elevator manager, "The old man with the 1951 drill." The elevator manager had said, "The same." The salesman had said nothing further at the elevator. He had driven back to the dealership and had thought about the March conversation at the parts counter, and had recognized, with the specific discomfort of a man whose professional framework has been challenged by facts it did not account for, that his assessment of the rusty drill and its owner had been based on the same visible evidence that the community's laughter had been based on, the appearance of the equipment rather than the performance of the equipment. The performance had been 41 bushels per acre. His new drills were selling on the promise of better seed-to-soil contact and improved planting precision. The 41 bushel yield from the 1951 drill's calibrated placement was the documented performance of what precision actually looked like when it was pursued through maintenance and calibration rather than through new iron. He had sold several of the new drills that spring on the argument that the old equipment could not produce modern yields. The argument had not been wrong in general. It had been wrong about the specific old man with the specific old drill who had been measuring his seed metering rate by catch and weigh for 16 years. He had driven back to the dealership without going into the showroom immediately. He had sat in the truck in the dealer lot for several minutes, which was the kind of sitting that happens when a professional framework that has been adequate for a number of years encounters a specific fact that the framework cannot easily incorporate. He had gone inside eventually and had called the parts department and had asked whether any other farmers in the county had been coming in for parts on old grain drills rather than buying new equipment. The parts man had said that there were maybe 6 or 8 regular customers who came in for parts on equipment that was 15 years old or older, and that most of them were from the northern part of the county, where the farms tended to run a little older, and the financing appetite was a little lower. He had asked if any of them had yields worth noting. The parts man had said he didn't keep that kind of information, but that the elevator would. He had called the elevator the following week with the specific professional inquiry of a man who is trying to understand something he has missed, and had asked whether there was a correlation between the farms that maintained and calibrated older equipment and the farms that were producing above the county average. The elevator manager had said he had not analyzed the data that way, but that thinking about it, several of the farms he associated with consistent above-average yields were farms he also associated with careful, methodical management of whatever equipment they ran, old or new. The salesman had not changed his sales approach based on this analysis. He was a JD salesman, and his livelihood depended on selling new equipment, and the analysis did not suggest that new equipment was wrong, only that old equipment correctly maintained was not as wrong as his sales framework had required it to be. But the analysis had modified his presentation in a way that was subtle and that he was not fully aware of until a colleague pointed it out 2 seasons later. He had stopped using the condition of the old equipment as the primary argument for replacement, and had started asking about the calibration practices of the farmer's current planting equipment before making the argument. The modification was the specific thing that learning from a correcting experience produces in a man who is capable of learning from correcting experiences. Not a wholesale reversal, but a specific adjustment to the framework's most vulnerable assumption, the one that the correcting experience had targeted. Walter Frick had not known about the salesman's modification. He had no particular awareness of the conversation the salesman was processing or the learning the elevator visit had initiated. He had been at the farm in October of 1974, entering the yield numbers in the farm account, and noting the 1974 season's specific result alongside the prior year's results in the format the account had maintained since his father's time. He had noted the yield result without elaboration, 41 bushels per acre, the column alongside the date, the same format as every prior year. He had not made a special notation because the yield, while the best documented result in the farm's history, was to his analysis the expected result of a favorable weather year combined with the confirmed seeding population and the fertility program that the farm account's fertilizer columns showed had been applied consistently. The expected result arriving was not, in his analysis, a special event. It was the confirmation that the approach was producing what the approach was designed to produce. He had made one additional notation in the service log alongside the October entry, seeding rate confirmation for 1974 season, all 12 rows within target specification at planting, 3rd row bearing replacement effective, calibration maintained. He had made this notation not as a commentary on the dealer's salesman or the community's response to the rusty drill, neither of which he was tracking or caring about, but as the standard operating documentation of what had produced the season's outcome in the format that the service log had always served, the record of what was done and what it produced, the 2 columns that together told the story that either column alone could not tell. The farm account and the service log together, the yield column in the account showing 41 bushels, the calibration notation in the service log showing all 12 rows confirmed at specification. The reader who had both documents could understand the relationship. The reader who had only the visible evidence, the rusted drill on the flatbed trailer, the 1963 Ford, the 61-year-old farmer in worn work clothes, had only the surface of the story. The surface was not the story. The calibration was the story. The calibration was in the service log. The service log had been in the farm's filing cabinet since 1958. Nobody at the dealership had asked to see it. Walter Frick had farmed the Van Wert County ground through the subsequent seasons with the same discipline that the 1974 season had expressed. The drill calibrated before every planting, the service log maintained without interruption, the farm account showing the accumulation that the yield supported. The farm crisis of the early 1980s had arrived to test every operation in the county, and the Frick operation had met it in the position that the discipline of the preceding decade had built. The equipment fund at the level that the farm's maintenance standard required, the operating reserve at the level the plan defined as the minimum, the land acquired in the late 1970s on the basis of a short private note to a neighboring family, rather than institutional financing at the rates that the prime rates climbed toward 21% in 1981, would have made catastrophic. The 1951 grain drill had continued in active service through the farm crisis years and beyond. It had been replaced in 1986 when Walter was 73, and the disk-wear data that the service log had been accumulating for 28 years showed that the drill had reached the threshold where the cost of the comprehensive rebuild that continued service, would require exceeded the cost of a replacement unit purchased on the used market at the disciplined standard the farm's equipment acquisitions had always followed. The replacement was a 1968 J.D. grain drill, purchased at a Putnam County estate sale for $480, assessed before purchase. Service log started at the first Van Wert County calibration run in the spring of 1986. The 1951 drill had been sold, not scrapped. Walter had placed a notice at the Van Wert County Farm Bureau and had received 3 inquiries within 2 weeks, the specific response to a piece of equipment whose reputation in this context was the specific reputation of equipment that had been correctly maintained for 28 years, and that a buyer who understood maintenance could acquire at a price that reflected the market's general disregard for age and surface condition. He had sold it to a young farmer in Paulding County for $140, more than the drill would have brought at a dispersal, because the buyer had understood what the maintenance record represented and had been willing to pay for it. He had given the buyer the complete service log with the drill, all 28 years of it, from the spring of 1958 through the fall of 1985. The calibration records alongside the maintenance records, the third row bearing replacement entry from March of 1974 with the post-replacement confirmation, the annual disc thickness measurements that showed the replacement schedule across 28 seasons, the October 1974 annotation noting the 41-bushel soybean year and the confirmed seeding rate that had accompanied it. The buyer had read the 1974 annotation at the Frick farm before loading the drill. He had looked up from the log and had said 41 bushels per acre in 1974. The county average was 28. Walter had said the season was favorable. The seeding rate was confirmed. The buyer had said, "You documented it here." Walter had said, "I document everything. The documentation tells you what produced the outcome. Without the documentation, you have the outcome, but not the cause. The cause is what you need to know in order to repeat the outcome." The buyer had said the rusty cedar. Walter had said the calibrated cedar. The rust is on the surface. The calibration is inside. He had driven back from the Paulding County delivery and had turned into the farm lane and had looked at the equipment yard where the 1951 drill had stood for 28 years and that now held the 1968 replacement. He had gone into the equipment shed and had picked up the service log he had started for the 1968 drill and had confirmed the first calibration entry from the spring of 1986 and had set it back in the shed beside the manual. The farm account was on the desk in the farm office. The farm account showed, in the column for 1974, the 41-bushel yield in Walter's handwriting. Beside it, in the same handwriting, the total revenue from the crop. The total revenue from the 1974 soybean crop on 220 acres at 41 bushels per acre had been the single largest annual crop revenue in the Frick Farm's documented history at that point. A record that had stood until the mid-1980s when the combination of additional acreage and continued yield discipline had exceeded it. The record had been produced by a rusty drill and a bearing that cost $12.30 at the Van Wert J.D. dealership parts counter. Or more precisely, the record had been produced by 28 years of annual calibration runs, the catch and weigh method confirming the metering rate within 2% of target before every planting season, the service log recording the confirmation, the disc thickness measurements determining the replacement schedule, the maintenance applied at the correct intervals without deferral. The rust was incidental. The calibration was causal. The salesman had assessed the incidental. The 41 bushels had confirmed the causal. Walter's son Howard had taken over primary management of the Frick farm in the mid-1980s, when Walter's age and the farm's increasing scale had made the transition both practical and planned. Howard had been working alongside his father since he was 15 years old, and had learned the calibration methodology in the way that children learn everything on working farms. Not in a classroom, not from a manual, but from standing beside the person who knows how to do it and watching the specific sequence of actions that produce the result that the person and the method together produce. He had done his first solo calibration run in the spring of 1978, when Walter had stood at the field edge with the service log, while Howard ran the catch and weigh sequence on all 12 rows. Walter had confirmed each row's reading against the target before Howard moved to the next. The process had taken an hour and 40 minutes, slightly longer than Walter's solo time, because Howard was building the specific feel for the sequence that only repetition produces and that repetition was in its early stages. Howard had said, after the 12th row's confirmation, every year. Walter had said, every year, before the first field pass of the planting season. Not after the first pass, when you have already planted 200 acres at whatever rate the unchecked metering produced. Before. Howard had said, what if the numbers are fine? Same as last year, no reason to think anything has changed. Walter had said, then the calibration takes an hour and you have confirmation. If the numbers are not fine and you find it in the calibration, the hour saved you from planting 200 acres at the wrong population. The hour is cheap insurance against the loss of a season's yield potential. Howard had said, what was the worst you ever found in the calibration? Walter had said in 1969, the third position on the left side had developed a metering disc wear pattern over the winter that I had not caught in the fall service. The dial said 44 pounds per acre. The catch and weigh showed 31. If I'd planted on the dial setting, I would have planted the left half of every field at 70% of target population. In a normal year, that would have cost me 8 to 12 bushels per acre on the affected half. In a good year, more. Howard had said, you caught it in the calibration. Walter had said, I caught it in the calibration because I do the calibration. If I did not do the calibration, I would have found it in the yield, which is a more expensive discovery. Howard had maintained the calibration practice from his first solo season in 1978, through his retirement of the 1968 drill in the mid-1990s and the replacement's first calibration season and all the seasons that followed. The service log that Walter had started in 1958 for the first drill had been the model for every log that followed. The same sections, the same format, the calibration record a permanent presence in the log structure because Walter had made it a permanent presence from the beginning, and Howard had continued it without the question of whether to continue it. The Van Wert JD dealership had changed ownership twice since 1974. The salesman from the March 1974 parts counter-encounter had retired in the early 1990s, and the specific memory of the rusty drill and the parts counter conversation had faded into the general background of his 30-year career. But the modification he had made to his sales presentation after the 1974 yield confirmation, the practice of asking about the calibration practices of the current equipment before making the argument for replacement, had persisted in his sales approach through the remainder of his career, the specific adjustment that a correcting experience had introduced into a professional framework that had previously not included it. He had mentioned this once at a dealer association retirement function in the early 1990s to a colleague who had asked him what the most useful thing he had learned in 30 years of farm equipment sales was. He had described the 1974 encounter at the parts counter and the 41-bushel confirmation at the elevator, and had said, I learned that the surface of the equipment tells you what the equipment looks like. The calibration record tells you what the equipment does. They are not the same information, and the second is more important than the first. His colleague had asked, who taught you that? He had said, an old man with a rusty seeder. The old man had been 61 years old in 1974. He had farmed the Van Wert County ground through the 1970s and the farm crisis of the early 1980s and the recovery years of the mid-1980s, and had turned the operation over to Howard in a planned transition that had left the Frick farm in the position that 40 years of Walter's discipline had built. 240 acres, accumulated through 3 acquisitions since the 1960s, all paid for. The equipment fleet maintained to the service log standard that every machine on the farm had been maintained to, since Walter had introduced the standard to the operation in the years after he returned from Korea in 1953 and had taken over from his father. He had died in 1992, at 79, in the farmhouse that the Frick family had been living in since the 1890s, with the service logs in the equipment shed and the farm account in the filing cabinet and the farm in Howard's management and the calibration practice continuing into the spring of that year and every spring after. The 1951 grain drill was somewhere in Paulding County, in the young farmer's operation that Walter had sold it to in 1985. The service log had gone with it. Whether the log had survived the change of hands and the subsequent decades was not something Walter had known, and not something Howard knew. What they knew was that the log had been complete and had been given to the buyer who had read the 1974 annotation at the Frick farm gate and had understood what it meant. The equipment goes to the buyer who will use it. The log goes with the equipment. The log is the equipment's history. The history is the evidence of what produced the outcomes that the farm account recorded in the income columns for 28 seasons of Van Wert County planting. The evidence was in the log. The log was in the buyer's hands. The buyer had read the October 1974 annotation. The annotation had said 41 bushels, seeding rate confirmed, calibration maintained. The salesman had laughed at the rusty seeder. The seeder had planted double. That was the whole account. That was sufficient. That was everything. The calibration continued into the next generation, without interruption. That was what the rusty surface had contained. Not rust, precision, 28 years of it documented without a gap. The specific mechanics of the catch and weigh calibration method that Walter had been applying since 1958 deserved a fuller account than the general description could provide, because the method's precision was the foundation of the story's outcome, and because the method itself was not complicated. It was simply the application of the specific attention that produced accurate knowledge about what the machine was doing, rather than what the machine's dial said it was doing. And the distinction between those two things was the distinction between the 41 bushel yield and the county average of 28. The catch and weigh method worked as follows. At the beginning of each planting season, before the first full field pass, Walter would park the drill on a flat surface and place collection bags over the seed tubes of each row position. He would disengage the seed discs from the soil. The drill would need to be on hard ground or elevated slightly so the discs were not loading against earth, and would turn the drill's drive wheel through a measured number of rotations corresponding to a known distance, typically the equivalent of 12 to 15 feet of actual ground travel. The seed that fell into each collection bag during those rotations would then be weighed on a small hanging scale, and the weight would be compared against the expected weight for that row's seeding rate at the distance run. The calculation was straightforward. If the drill was set to plant at a given rate and the row spacing was a known width, the weight of seed that should come from each tube over 12 feet of travel was a calculable number. If the measured weight matched the calculated number within 2%, the row was correctly calibrated. If the measured weight differed by more than 2%, the metering unit required adjustment. The rate dial, the tension spring on the seed disc, or in cases like the 1969 third position failure, the worn component that was causing the metering disc to deliver less seed per revolution than the dial specified, Walter had learned this method from a Van Wert County Extension Bulletin published in 1957, the year before he bought the 1951 drill, and had applied it from the drill's first season at the Frick farm. The bulletin had described the method for confirming planting equipment calibration and had included the calculation tables for common seed varieties at standard row spacings. Walter had kept the bulletin in the same filing cabinet as the service log, the reference document alongside the record of its application. By 1974, he had been applying the method for 16 years without missing a season, and the accumulated calibration records in the service log showed the year-by-year history of what each row position had actually been metering versus what the dial had specified. The history was instructive in a specific way. In 12 of the 16 seasons, the calibration had confirmed the dial settings within the 2% tolerance, and no adjustment had been required. In 4 seasons, 1961, 1965, 1969, and 1972, the calibration had found a discrepancy requiring investigation and correction. In each of those 4 seasons, the investigation had identified a specific mechanical cause: a worn metering component, a shifted spring tension, a seed tube partial blockage in 1972 that was not visible from outside the tube and would not have been identified without the catch-and-weigh discrepancy triggering the inspection. 4 seasons in 16, where the calibration had caught something the dial would not have reported. 4 seasons where the planting would have proceeded at an incorrect population if the calibration had not been done. The population error in each of those seasons, left uncorrected, would have produced a yield outcome that Walter estimated at between 5 and 15% below the yield that the confirmed calibration produced, depending on the severity of the discrepancy and the weather conditions of the affected season. In 1974, the weather conditions had been favorable enough that a 5 to 15% population discrepancy would have been visible in the yield differential between the affected fields and the correctly planted fields if there had been incorrectly planted fields. There were not, because the calibration had confirmed all 12 rows at the target specification and the planting had proceeded at the confirmed rate. The 41 bushel yield was the yield that the confirmed rate had produced in favorable conditions. Whether a discrepancy would have been present in 1974 without the calibration was not something Walter could know. The 3rd row bearing had been replaced, and the replacement had been confirmed, but the other 11 rows had also been confirmed that season as part of the standard protocol, not specifically because Walter expected any of them to be off. He had mentioned this to Howard in one of the kitchen table conversations that had been the format of the operation's knowledge transmission. Across the years, Howard was learning the farm's management. He had said, "You cannot calibrate only the rows you expect to be wrong. You calibrate all 12 every season, because the rows you do not expect to be wrong are the rows where the wear is accumulating below the level you can see without measuring. By the time a row is far enough off to see without measuring, you have already planted several acres at the wrong rate. The measurement finds it at the start, not after." Howard had said, "So the whole value of the calibration is that it finds the thing you did not expect." Walter had said, "The expected problems you would catch in the pre-season service inspection. The calibration catches the problems between the service inspection and the planting. The wear that is inside the metering unit, invisible from outside, producing a result that the dial cannot detect because the dial does not measure what the machine is doing. The dial measures what you have told the machine to do. The calibration measures what the machine is actually doing. Those are different things." Howard had written this in the farm account margin beside the 1978 entry, the year of his first solo calibration run. The principle alongside the number, the same practice that every farm family in these accounts had used to preserve the knowledge that the number's context required. The account's margin said, "The dial measures the instruction, the calibration measures the result." The salesman at the Van Wert dealership had been selling precision planting equipment on the promise of better seed-to-soil contact. The precision planting equipment delivered what it promised when it was correctly set up and correctly calibrated. The 1951 drill delivered what its calibration produced when the calibration was correctly done. The difference between the new equipment's promise and the old equipment's performance was not the equipment. It was whether the discipline of the calibration was applied to whatever equipment was being used. A new drill that was sold on the promise of better precision and then operated for 3 seasons without calibration verification was not a precision planting tool. It was a dial-setting tool, and the dial-setting tool's performance was determined by what the dial happened to be producing at the metering unit level, which could differ from the dial specification by the amount that 3 seasons of metering disc wear and spring tension shift had accumulated without measurement. The new drill's precision was the theoretical precision of a correctly calibrated unit, not the actual precision of the specific unit on the specific farm in the specific season. Walter's 1951 drill's precision was the actual precision of a unit confirmed by catch-and-weigh measurement every season since 1958. The theoretical and the actual were not the same thing. The salesman had been selling the theoretical. Walter had been farming the actual. The 41 bushel yield was the actual expressing itself in favorable conditions. The community that had heard about the yield in the fall and winter of 1974 and 1975 had processed it through several frameworks simultaneously, and the frameworks had not all arrived at the same understanding. The yield result itself was not disputed. The elevator records were specific. Walter's reputation for accurate record-keeping was well established in Van Wert County, and the 41 bushel number stood as confirmed. The question was, what had produced it? Several members of the community had attributed the result primarily to the season's weather. The favorable June rainfall and the good August temperatures had been county-wide conditions and had contributed to above-average yields across many farms. And the attribution of Walter's result to weather was not wrong, it was simply incomplete. Weather had been one contributing factor. The confirmed seeding population had been another. The soil fertility program had been a third. The specific interaction of all three under the conditions that prevailed in 1974 had produced the 41 bushel outcome. A farmer named Flippo, who had worked the ground adjacent to the Frick Farm's northeast quarter for 20 years, had come to Walter in February of 1975 with a question that was specific enough that Walter had taken the time to answer it fully. Flippot had said, "You run the same rotation as I do on comparable ground, and your soybean yield in 1974 was about 40% above mine on a very similar season. I want to understand the difference." Walter had said, "What was your seeding population last spring?" Flippot had said, "Whatever the drill was set to, I set it at the recommended rate for the variety, and I plant. I have not changed that practice in 10 years. Walter had said, "Have you confirmed the drill is actually metering at the rate the dial specifies?" Flippot had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I assumed it was." Walter had said, "When did you last calibrate it?" Flippot had said, "I have not calibrated it since I bought it 8 years ago." Walter had said, "Then you do not know what your seeding population was last spring. You know what the dial was set at. You do not know what came out the seed tubes." Flippo had sat with this for a moment. He had said, "And you do know." Walter had said, "I measure it before every planting season. I have measured it every year since 1958. The log shows what the measurement was every year." Flippot had asked to see the calibration section of the service log. Walter had brought him to the farm office and had opened the log to the calibration records. Flippot had read through several years' entries, the confirmation notations, the 4 years where discrepancies had been found and corrected, the 1974 entry showing all 12 rows confirmed at specification before the first field pass. He had said, "You found actual metering problems 4 times in 16 years. Walter had said, 4 times, where the measurement differed from the dial by more than 2%. In each case, there was a mechanical cause. In each case, the correction was made before planting. Filippo had said, "In 8 years of running my drill without calibration, I may have planted at the wrong population as many as 3 or 4 seasons without knowing it." Walter had said, "Or you may have been within tolerance all 8 years. You do not know. The calibration would tell you. The absence of the calibration means you do not know." Filippo had gone home and had calibrated his drill the following weekend in February before the planting season. He had found the left side outside row producing at 83% of the dial setting, a 17% shortfall on the outermost row that had been accumulating since some point in the previous 3 or 4 seasons, as the outer row's disc wear had progressed. He had done the investigation, found the worn disc, replaced it, confirmed the replacement, planted 1975 at the confirmed rate. His 1975 soybean yield had been his best documented result to that point, which was not entirely attributable to the calibration correction. The 1975 season had its own character, and the yield outcome reflected multiple variables. But the left side outer row had been contributing its share to the population for the first time in several years, and the correction had moved the planting from the below-target population that the worn disc had been producing to the on-target population that the replacement and calibration had restored. He had told Walter about the 1975 result at the Farm Bureau meeting in the fall of that year. He had said, "I found a 17% shortfall on the outside row." Walter had said, "What was the cause?" Filippo had said, "Worn disc, replaced it, confirmed the replacement. The 1975 yield was the best I have recorded." Walter had said, "You calibrated before the season." Filippo had said, "Yes." Walter had said, "That is the value of the measurement. You found the problem in February instead of in October." This exchange, or a version of it that preserved its essential content, had moved through the Van Wert County farming network with the efficiency that useful information moves through agricultural communities when the information has a specific and testable application. By the spring of 1976, at least 4 Van Wert County farmers who had heard the Frick yield story and the Filippo calibration account had added the catch-and-weigh procedure to their pre-planting routine. By 1978, the number was larger, and the Van Wert County Extension Office had incorporated the calibration method into its spring planting workshops on the basis of the local evidence that the Frick result and the Filippo correction had provided. The Extension Workshop had attributed the calibration method to the Extension Bulletin from 1957 rather than to Walter Frick specifically, because Extension Workshops attributed methods to their institutional sources, and Walter Frick's name was not in the Extension Bulletin. But the farmers who had added the calibration to their practice after the Frick and Filippo accounts had attributed it to what they had actually heard. An old man with a rusty cedar who had been confirming his metering rate by catch and weigh since 1958, and who had produced a 41 bushel yield in 1974 that the county average could not match. The rusty cedar was the frame of the account. The calibration was the account's content. The salesman had laughed at the frame. The content had produced 41 bushels. That was the whole of it. Walter Frick had not attended the Extension Workshop. He had been calibrating his planting equipment for 20 years by the time the workshop began, and he had nothing to learn from a workshop about a method he had been applying annually since before some of the attendees had been farming. He had heard about the workshop from Howard and had said, "Good. More people calibrating means fewer low population years in the county, which means better average yields and a healthier farming community. That is a good outcome." Howard had said, "You started it." Walter had said, Flippo's outside row started it. The worn disc was the evidence that made the argument specific. Without a local example, the workshop would have been a theoretical recommendation. With the Flippo example, it was a documented local result. The community responds to local results better than to theoretical recommendations. Howard had said, and the 41 bushels. Walter had said, and the 41 bushels. Yes, but the 41 bushels was my farm. The Flippo correction was the community. The community needed its own version of the argument, which Flippo provided when he found the worn disc. This distinction between the individual result and the community transmission of the principle the result contained was the specific kind of practical epistemology that Van Wert County farming had produced in a man who had been thinking about the relationship between what he knew and how he knew it for 60 years of farming, and the years before farming that had prepared him for it. He had been a precise man in a specific way. Not the precision of a man who controls his environment, but the precision of a man who measures his environment accurately and acts on what the measurement shows, rather than on what he expected the measurement to show. The calibration confirmed the expectation in 12 of 16 seasons and corrected the reality in 4. The value of the confirmation was that it allowed the 12 good seasons to proceed with confidence. The value of the 4 corrections was that they prevented what the uncorrected reality would have cost. Both values were in the service log. Both were in the 41 bushels. Both were in the rusty surface that the salesman had laughed at. The surface had said old. The log had said precise. The harvest had confirmed the log. That was sufficient. The calibration continued. The log continued. The farm continued into the second generation without interruption, without a season missed. That was everything. The farm account's record of the 1974 yield was not a dramatic entry. It was the same format as every other year's entry. The crop, the acreage, the yield, the price at delivery, the total revenue. The 41 bushel number was in the yield column in Walter's handwriting, no larger and no more emphatic than the 31 bushel number from 1970 or the 35 bushel number from 1972. The account did not annotate exceptional results with anything beyond the accurate recording of the result. Exceptional results were not, in Walter's accounting practice, occasions for emphasis. They were data points in a series of data points, and the series told a story that any individual data point could not tell alone. The story the series told from 1958 to 1985 was a yield series for Van Wert County soybeans and corn that ran consistently above the county average in seasons with favorable weather and consistently above the county average in seasons with average weather, and only slightly below the county average in the 2 difficult weather years of 1974's early drought period, which had resolved before it affected yield, and the 1988 drought, which had affected yields county-wide in a way that no management practice could fully offset. The consistency of the above-average performance across favorable and average and difficult conditions was the specific signature of a management practice that was producing the yield potential that the weather made available rather than leaving some of the potential on the table through population errors. Howard had analyzed this pattern explicitly in the late 1980s, when he was making the transition to primary management and was going back through the farm account's full history with the attention of a man who is inheriting a document and wants to understand what it contains. He had plotted the Frick yield data against the Van Wert County Extension Service's published county average data for the same period. A simple comparison, 2 series on the same scale, the visual pattern revealing the consistent differential that the account's individual entries had recorded. The differential had been remarkable in its consistency. In 27 of the 28 seasons covered by the 1958 to 1985 service log period, the Frick soybean yield had been at or above the county average. In 25 of those seasons, it had been more than 10% above the county average. The single season below the county average, 1963, a wet spring that had delayed the frick planting and had affected germination on the low drainage fields, had been 1% below, a deviation within the range of normal variability rather than a management failure. Howard had brought this analysis to Walter in the fall of 1988. He had laid the two series on the kitchen table and had pointed to the consistent differential and had said, 27 seasons above the county average. The calibration is in every one of them. Walter had looked at the comparison for a moment. He had said, the calibration is the condition that makes the other management variables express themselves correctly. Good soil fertility applied at the right rate to fields planted at the wrong population produces less yield than the fertility program deserves. The calibration makes the fertility work. The calibration makes the variety's yield potential available. You cannot isolate the calibration's contribution from the other variables because the other variables depend on the calibration to express at the level they were designed to express at. Howard had said, but if you removed the calibration, the series would look different. Walter had said, if you removed the calibration, the 4 seasons where I found mechanical problems, 1961, 1965, 1969, 1972, would have been planted at incorrect populations, and in those years where the incorrect population was severe enough to matter, the yield outcome would have been lower than what the record shows. By how much, I cannot say precisely, but the record shows what the confirmed calibration produced. The alternative would have produced something less. Howard had said, 27 seasons of something more than the alternative. Walter had said yes. He had put the comparison back on the table and had looked at it for another moment. He had said, the account is the summary. The calibration is the explanation. Without the explanation, the summary is just numbers. With the explanation, the summary is a management record. Howard had filed the comparison alongside the farm account in the filing cabinet, the 2 data series on the same sheet, the visual pattern clear, the kitchen table conversation preserved in the margin note Howard had added to the comparison sheet. The calibration is the explanation. That was the kitchen table's teaching, expressed in the margin of a data comparison that a son had brought to a father in the fall of 1988, and that the father had received with the specific attention of a man who has been keeping the record for 30 years and who is being shown, for the first time, the full shape of what the record contains. The shape was consistent, disciplined, above average, documented. That was what the Rusty Cedar had produced when correctly calibrated across 28 seasons. That was what the salesman had laughed at in March of 1974. That was what the 41 bushels had answered. The answer was in the log. The log was in the filing cabinet. The filing cabinet was on a farm that had been producing above-average yields since 1958, since before the salesman was selling new drills, since before the community had formed its opinion of the Rusty implement on the flatbed trailer. Since the first spring that Walter Frick had parked the 1951 drill on flat ground and hung the collection bags and turned the drive wheel and weighed what came out and compared it to what was supposed to come out and found that the 2 numbers agreed and planted on the confirmed measurement. Since then, every season since then, without a single missed year, that was the whole account. That was sufficient.